My boss said, "I'm giving your promotion to someone who actually needs the money," right after I closed the biggest deal of the year. My boss said those words while I was still standing in his office holding the signed contract from Apex Technologies, a deal worth $8.3 million in revenue for our software company. I'd spent 11 months cultivating the relationship with their chief technology officer, flying to Seattle 6 different times, revising our proposal 4 times, and personally addressing every single technical concern their engineering team raised. The ink on the signature page was so fresh I could smell it, that distinct scent of toner and expensive paper. Jeffrey Langford, my boss and the vice president of sales at Catalyst Solutions, took the contract from my hands, flipped through it with barely a glance, and set it on his desk like it was junk mail. Then he leaned back in his leather chair, the one that cost more than my monthly rent, and told me he was giving the regional director position to someone else. I stood there trying to process what I was hearing because it made no sense. The promotion had been promised to me in writing. I had the email from Jeffrey dated 3 months ago stating that closing the Apex deal would secure my advancement to regional director, complete with a $40,000 salary increase and management of the entire Western sales team. I'd been working at Catalyst Solutions for exactly 5 years and 7 months when Jeffrey made his announcement, and I'd been the top sales performer for 4 of those years. I started as a junior account executive right out of college, cold calling prospects and booking meetings for senior salespeople who treated me like their personal assistant. I worked 80-hour weeks learning the industry, studying our product line, and developing relationships with potential clients who initially wouldn't give me the time of day. My first major deal came in year 2, a $600,000 contract with a mid-sized logistics company that expanded into a $2.4 million multi-year agreement. Jeffrey noticed that success and promoted me to senior account executive, giving me bigger territories and more complex prospects. By year 3, I was consistently hitting 150% of quota, while most of my colleagues struggled to reach 100%. Jeffrey would parade me around at company meetings as his star performer, using my numbers to motivate the rest of the team. He told me multiple times that I had a real future at Catalyst, that people like me who combined technical knowledge with sales ability were rare and valuable. The Apex deal had been my obsession for almost a year. Their CTO, Dr. Priya Sharma, was notoriously difficult to impress and had turned down every software vendor who'd approached them over the past 3 years. I spent weeks researching their infrastructure, reading their technical blog posts, and understanding their unique scaling challenges. My first meeting with Dr. Sharma lasted 15 minutes before she dismissed me, saying our platform wouldn't meet their needs. I didn't give up. I brought in our lead engineer to address her concerns directly. I arranged for her to speak with 3 of our existing clients who had similar technical requirements. I flew to Seattle on my own dime twice when she wouldn't approve travel reimbursement for additional meetings. Slowly, methodically, I built her trust and demonstrated that our solution could solve problems their current system couldn't handle. When she finally agreed to a pilot program, I personally oversaw the implementation, working 16-hour days to ensure everything went perfectly. The pilot exceeded every performance metric we'd promised. Dr. Sharma was so impressed, she expanded the original contract scope from $4.5 million to $8.3 million, adding modules and services we hadn't even proposed initially. Jeffrey knew how hard I'd worked on Apex because I'd kept him updated every step of the way. When I walked into his office that Thursday afternoon with the signed contract, I expected celebration, maybe even a bonus for exceeding the deal size. Instead, I got that statement about giving my promotion to someone who actually needs the money. I asked him what he meant by that, trying to keep my voice steady even though my hands were starting to shake. He explained in this patronizing tone that the regional director position would be going to Kevin Ortiz, a sales representative who'd been with the company for less than 3 years and whose performance was consistently mediocre at best. Jeffrey said Kevin had 3 kids and a mortgage, implying that I, being single and living in what he assumed was some bachelor apartment, didn't have the same financial pressures. I reminded him about the written promise he'd made, pulling up the email on my phone and showing it to him. Jeffrey waved it away like it was nothing, saying circumstances had changed and that Kevin needed this opportunity more than I did. He suggested I should be happy for my colleague and that being a team player was more important than personal advancement. The shock of his words was physical. My chest felt tight, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I'd turned down 2 job offers from competitors in the past year, specifically because Jeffrey had promised me this promotion. I'd invested everything into Catalyst Solutions, believing that hard work and results would be rewarded. Now he was telling me that none of that mattered, because someone else had more appealing personal circumstances. I asked him if this decision was final, and he nodded, already turning his attention to his computer screen like the conversation was over. I stood there for another few seconds, watching him type an email, completely dismissing me. Then I walked out of his office, went straight to my desk, and sat down in a daze. My colleague, Rachel Kim, who sat in the cubicle next to mine, noticed something was wrong and asked if I was okay. I told her what had just happened and watched her face change from concern to outrage. She said that couldn't be legal, that he couldn't just change the terms of a promised promotion based on someone's personal life. I said I didn't know, but I was going to find out. I spent that evening in my apartment researching employment law and reading through every email Jeffrey had sent me over the past year. The more I read, the angrier I became. The email from 3 months ago was explicit. stating in clear language that successful closure of the Apex Technologies deal would result in my promotion to regional director effective immediately upon contract signing. There were no conditions mentioned about personal circumstances or financial need. It was a straightforward performance-based promise tied to a specific business outcome. I'd delivered that outcome, exceeding the target by nearly 100%, and now he was reneging on the agreement. I drafted an email to Jeffrey requesting a formal meeting to discuss the situation, carefully wording it to reference the original promotion promise and asking for clarification on what had changed. I sent it at 11:30 p.m., too angry to sleep and wanting to document my objection immediately. Jeffrey responded the next morning with 2 sentences saying his decision was final and that I should focus on my next sales targets instead of dwelling on this situation. The casual dismissiveness of his response made my blood boil. Rachel suggested I go to HR, and I scheduled a meeting with Victoria Ellis, the director of human resources who'd been with Catalyst for over a decade. Victoria's office was on the 3rd floor in a corner with windows overlooking the parking lot. She greeted me professionally, but I could tell from her expression she already knew why I was there. I explained the situation from start to finish, showing her Jeffrey's original email promising the promotion and his subsequent decision to give it to Kevin Ortiz instead. Victoria listened while taking notes on a legal pad, her face neutral and unreadable. When I finished, she asked if I had documentation of my performance metrics and the Apex deal closure. I said I had everything, including the signed contract and my sales records showing I'd been the top performer for years. Victoria nodded and said she'd need to review the situation with legal counsel before making any recommendations. She asked me not to discuss this with other employees while the review was ongoing, saying it could complicate the process. I agreed, though I pointed out that Jeffrey had already announced Kevin's promotion to the entire sales team in a company-wide email that morning. The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety and anger. I couldn't stop thinking about the injustice of the situation, replaying Jeffrey's words over and over, someone who actually needs the money. The phrase implied that I didn't deserve the promotion based on merit alone, that financial need was somehow a valid criterion for advancement. It suggested that my performance didn't matter as much as my personal circumstances. Monday morning arrived, and I walked into the office to find Kevin Ortiz sitting in what should have been my new office, already arranging his family photos on the desk. Other colleagues congratulated him as they passed by, unaware of what had actually happened. I went to my cubicle and tried to focus on work, but every time I saw Kevin or Jeffrey, my stomach churned with resentment. Rachel came by during lunch and asked if I'd heard anything from HR. I said not yet, and she told me she'd done some research over the weekend. She'd found 3 other instances in the past 2 years where Jeffrey had made similar decisions, promoting less qualified employees based on personal situations rather than performance. She'd compiled the information in a document and offered to share it with me if I wanted to pursue this further. Victoria Ellis called me into her office on Monday afternoon, exactly 3 business days after our initial meeting. She had a lawyer with her this time, a man in his 50s named Daniel Friedman, who introduced himself as the company's employment counsel. Daniel explained that he'd reviewed my documentation and Jeffrey's emails, and that while the situation was unfortunate, the promotion email I'd been relying on wasn't technically a binding contract. He said Jeffrey had used language like would result in, rather than absolute guarantees, and that company policy gave management discretion in promotion decisions. I argued that any reasonable person would interpret that email as a firm promise, especially given the context and my subsequent actions in closing the deal. Daniel acknowledged my perspective, but said from a legal standpoint, the company had latitude in these decisions. Victoria added that they appreciated my contributions and suggested I focus on future opportunities rather than this particular promotion. I felt the walls closing in as I realized they were protecting Jeffrey and the company rather than addressing the obvious unfairness of the situation. I asked directly if they thought it was appropriate to make promotion decisions based on employees' personal financial situations. Victoria and Daniel exchanged a glance before Victoria said that many factors go into promotion decisions and they couldn't comment on the specifics of Jeffrey's reasoning. I left that meeting knowing the company wasn't going to help me. Rachel was waiting by my cubicle when I got back, and I told her what had happened. She said she wasn't surprised, that HR existed to protect the company, not the employees. Then she handed me a business card for an employment attorney named Margaret Foster, who specialized in wrongful termination and workplace discrimination cases. Rachel said her cousin had used Margaret successfully a few years ago for a similar situation. I looked at the card, a simple design with Margaret's name and credentials listed as having 23 years of employment law experience. I called the number from my car during lunch the next day, sitting in the parking lot of a coffee shop near the office. Margaret's receptionist scheduled me for a consultation that Thursday evening after work hours. The consultation cost $200 for an hour, which I paid gladly because I needed someone to tell me if I had any legal recourse or if I was just being naive about how the business world actually operated. Margaret Foster's office was in a professional building downtown, 4th floor, suite 412. She was in her early 50s with gray-streaked dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything. Her office walls were covered with framed certificates and photos with what looked like various legal organizations and community groups. She shook my hand firmly and gestured to a chair across from her desk, then asked me to walk her through the entire situation without leaving anything out. I spent 30 minutes explaining everything from the Apex deal to Jeffrey's decision to the HR meeting. Margaret took detailed notes and asked specific questions about dates, exact wording in emails, and company policies I might be aware of. When I finished, she sat back and reviewed her notes for a full minute before speaking. She said the promotion promise itself, while not a formal contract, could potentially be considered a binding commitment depending on how a court interpreted the circumstances and my reliance on that promise. More importantly, she said Jeffrey's stated reason for giving the promotion to Kevin, that Kevin needed the money more, could constitute illegal discrimination based on family status or marital status depending on how it was documented. Margaret explained that California law prohibited employment discrimination based on marital status, and if Jeffrey had explicitly stated that Kevin was getting the promotion because he had a family and I didn't, that could violate those protections. She asked if I had any witnesses to Jeffrey's statement or any written documentation of his reasoning. I said it had been a private conversation in his office with no witnesses, and Jeffrey had been careful not to put his reasoning in writing. Margaret nodded like she'd expected that answer and said that was the challenge with these cases. Without clear documentation or witnesses, it became my word against his, and companies rarely admitted to discriminatory reasoning. She asked about my performance records and the email trail with Jeffrey. I showed her everything on my laptop, including the original promotion email, my sales metrics, and the Apex contract. She reviewed each document carefully, occasionally making notes. After 20 minutes of review, she looked up and said, I had the foundation of a case, but it would be difficult and expensive to pursue. She estimated legal costs could run between $15,000 and $50,000, depending on how aggressively the company fought back, and even if I won, the most likely outcome would be a settlement, rather than actually getting the promotion. The financial reality of pursuing legal action hit me hard. I had savings, but not enough to fund a prolonged legal battle without serious financial stress. Margaret seemed to sense my hesitation and suggested an alternative approach. She said I could file a complaint with the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing, which would investigate the situation at no cost to me. The DFEH had authority to examine company practices and could potentially force Catalyst Solutions to address the situation. She warned that DFEH investigations could take months and weren't guaranteed to result in action, but it was a way to formally document my complaint and put pressure on the company. I asked what would happen if I filed a complaint. Margaret said the DFEH would notify Catalyst Solutions of the investigation, interview relevant parties, review documents, and ultimately issue findings. If they found evidence of discrimination, they could mandate corrective action or mediate a settlement. She also mentioned that filing a DFEH complaint would protect me from retaliation under state law, meaning the company couldn't fire me or punish me for making the complaint. I left her office that evening with a draft DFEH complaint form and a clearer sense of my options, none of which felt satisfying, but at least gave me a path forward. I spent the weekend drafting my DFEH complaint, carefully documenting every relevant detail and attaching copies of emails and performance records. The form asked for specific information about the alleged discrimination, including dates, witnesses, and the basis of the discrimination. I described Jeffrey's statement about Kevin needing the money more and explained how it appeared to be based on family status. I submitted the complaint online Sunday night and received an automated confirmation that it had been received and assigned a case number. The reality of what I'd just done settled over me like a weight. I'd formally accused my employer of discrimination. There was no going back from this point. Monday morning I went to work as usual, wondering if anyone knew about the complaint yet. The DFEH notification to Catalyst Solutions wouldn't happen immediately, so I had at least a few days before things got complicated. I tried to focus on my regular work, following up with existing clients and prospecting new deals, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. Every interaction with Jeffrey felt loaded with unspoken tension. He'd see me in the hallway and nod like nothing had changed, like he hadn't just destroyed my career trajectory based on arbitrary personal criteria. The DFEH notification arrived at Catalyst Solutions 10 days after I filed my complaint. I knew it had arrived because Victoria Ellis called me into her office that afternoon with Daniel Friedman, the employment attorney, present again. Victoria's expression was tight and professional as she informed me that the company had been notified of my discrimination complaint. Daniel asked if I'd filed it, and I confirmed that I had. He said the company took all discrimination allegations seriously and would cooperate fully with the DFEH investigation. Then he asked me to describe in detail the basis of my complaint. I repeated what I'd already documented, Jeffrey's statement about giving the promotion to Kevin because Kevin needed the money more, and the apparent discrimination based on family status. Daniel took notes while maintaining a neutral expression that revealed nothing about what he was thinking. Victoria asked if I felt comfortable continuing to work under Jeffrey's supervision during the investigation. I said I didn't have much choice unless they were offering to transfer me to a different department. She said they'd consider options, but couldn't make any immediate changes. The meeting ended with an uncomfortable handshake and a reminder that retaliation against me for filing the complaint would violate company policy and state law. The atmosphere at work became toxic almost immediately. Jeffrey stopped speaking to me directly, communicating only through email and keeping every message coldly professional. Other members of the sales team who'd heard about the DFEH complaint through office gossip started treating me differently. Some were supportive, like Rachel, who continued to encourage me and share information. Others, particularly those who were friends with Jeffrey or Kevin, became distant and sometimes openly hostile. I overheard one colleague, a guy named Derek Manning who'd been at the company for 8 years, tell another salesperson that I was being vindictive and trying to destroy Kevin's career out of jealousy. The comment stung because it misrepresented everything about the situation. I wasn't trying to hurt Kevin. I was trying to address the fact that I'd been denied a promised promotion based on discriminatory reasoning. But in the simplified narrative spreading through the office, I was the villain making trouble instead of accepting a management decision gracefully. 3 weeks after the DFEH notification, an investigator named James Crawford contacted me to schedule an interview. He explained over the phone that he'd been assigned to my case and needed to gather detailed information about the circumstances of the alleged discrimination. We scheduled a meeting at a neutral location, a conference room at the local library, for the following Wednesday at 6 p.m. after my work hours. James was in his early 40s, African-American, with wire-rimmed glasses and a methodical way of speaking that suggested careful attention to detail. He had me walk through the entire timeline again while he recorded the conversation on a digital recorder after obtaining my consent. He asked specific questions about Jeffrey's exact words, the context of the conversation, and any witnesses who might have been present. I admitted there were no witnesses to the actual conversation, but mentioned that Rachel Kim and others knew about the promotion promise and the subsequent decision to give it to Kevin. James made notes about potential witnesses and said he'd be interviewing them as part of the investigation. He also requested copies of all relevant emails and documents, which I'd already prepared and brought on a USB drive. James explained that his investigation would include interviews with Jeffrey, Kevin, Victoria Ellis, Daniel Friedman, and several other employees who might have relevant information. He said the process would take approximately 60 to 90 days to complete, after which the DFEH would issue findings and recommendations. I asked what would happen if they found evidence of discrimination. James said the DFEH could mediate a settlement between me and the company, or if mediation failed, issue me a right-to-sue letter that would allow me to pursue the case in civil court. He was careful not to offer any opinion about the strength of my case, maintaining professional neutrality throughout the interview. After 90 minutes of detailed questions, he thanked me for my cooperation and said he'd be in touch if he needed additional information. I left the library feeling simultaneously hopeful that someone was taking my complaint seriously and anxious about what would happen when Jeffrey and others were interviewed about the situation. The retaliation started subtly at first. Jeffrey began excluding me from important meetings that I'd normally attend. Sales strategy sessions that I'd been part of for years suddenly didn't include me on the invite list. When I asked Jeffrey about it via email, he responded that he was streamlining the meeting attendee list and my presence wasn't necessary. My largest existing account, a manufacturing company called Precision Industrial that had been my client for 3 years, was reassigned to another sales representative without explanation. I discovered the reassignment when the client called my personal cell phone asking why someone else was now their point of contact. I immediately went to Jeffrey's office to ask what was happening, and he claimed it was a routine redistribution of accounts to balance workload. I pointed out that my workload was manageable and that removing my highest revenue account seemed retaliatory. Jeffrey's expression hardened, and he said if I had concerns about retaliation, I should take them up with HR. The dismissive way he said it made clear he knew exactly what he was doing and didn't care that it was illegal. I documented every instance of changed treatment and filed a supplemental complaint with the DFEH describing the retaliation. Margaret Foster, the employment attorney I'd consulted with, reviewed my documentation and said I was building a strong retaliation case on top of the original discrimination complaint. She explained that retaliation claims were often easier to prove than the underlying discrimination because the timing and changed circumstances created a clear pattern. James Crawford, the DFEH investigator, added the retaliation allegations to his investigation and scheduled follow-up interviews with several employees who'd witnessed the changed treatment. Rachel Kim gave a statement to James describing how my role had been systematically diminished after filing the complaint. Another colleague, an account manager named Lisa Tran, who worked closely with the sales team, also provided a statement detailing the account reassignment and meeting exclusions. The evidence was mounting, but so was the stress of working in an increasingly hostile environment. My performance review came up 6 weeks after filing the DFEH complaint, and Jeffrey used it as another opportunity for retaliation. Despite my documented success with the Apex deal and my consistent top-tier performance over the years, he rated me as meets expectations instead of the exceeds expectations rating I'd received every previous year. The written comments claimed I had issues with teamwork and accepting management decisions, thinly veiled references to the DFEH complaint. Jeffrey recommended no merit increase for the year, citing budget constraints that somehow didn't prevent other employees from receiving raises. I signed the review with a written notation that I disagreed with the assessment and believed it was retaliatory. Jeffrey's mouth tightened when he read my notation, but he didn't respond, simply filing the signed review in his folder and dismissing me from his office. The performance review went into my supplemental DFEH complaint as additional evidence of retaliation. The turning point came during James Crawford's interview with Kevin Ortiz. I didn't know about this until later, but apparently Kevin was deeply uncomfortable during the interview and ultimately admitted that Jeffrey had told him the promotion was his because he had a family to support, and I was single without those responsibilities. Kevin had accepted the promotion, but felt guilty about the circumstances, particularly after learning about my DFEH complaint and realizing the decision might have been discriminatory. James asked Kevin if he'd be willing to provide that information in a sworn statement, and after thinking about it for several days, Kevin agreed. His statement was devastating to Jeffrey's position because it came from the person who'd benefited from the discriminatory decision and confirmed exactly what I'd alleged. James also interviewed Dr. Priya Sharma from Apex Technologies, who provided a detailed statement about my work on the deal and her surprise when she learned I hadn't received the promised promotion. She said I'd specifically mentioned the promotion as motivation during the final negotiations, and that she'd chosen to expand the contract size, partly because of my dedication and expertise. James Crawford completed his investigation after 83 days and issued his findings in a formal report sent to both me and Catalyst Solutions. The report concluded that substantial evidence supported my allegations of both discrimination based on marital status and retaliation for filing the complaint. It documented Jeffrey's statement about Kevin needing the money more, confirmed by Kevin's own admission, and found that this reasoning violated California's Fair Employment and Housing Act. The report also detailed the pattern of retaliation, including account reassignment, meeting exclusions, and the negative performance review. James recommended that Catalyst Solutions remedy the situation by offering me the regional director position I'd been promised, providing back pay for the salary difference since the promotion should have taken effect, and implementing training for management on prohibited discrimination. The DFEH offered to mediate a settlement between me and the company to resolve the matter without litigation. The settlement mediation was scheduled at the DFEH office downtown, a government building with fluorescent lights and worn carpet that had seen thousands of employment disputes. Margaret Foster represented me, even though I still couldn't afford her full services, because she agreed to attend the mediation for a reduced fee of $1,500, seeing it as a relatively quick process. Catalyst Solutions sent Daniel Friedman, the employment attorney, along with Victoria Ellis and a senior executive I'd never met named Patricia Whitmore, who apparently had authority to make settlement decisions. The mediator was a DFEH official named Robert Chen, who'd been doing employment mediations for 15 years. He explained the process, separate rooms for each party with him shuttling between to facilitate negotiations. We started with everyone in the same room while Robert outlined the DFEH findings and the basis for settlement discussions. Daniel Friedman immediately challenged several aspects of the findings, arguing that Kevin's statement was unreliable and that the retaliation claims were coincidental timing rather than intentional punishment. Margaret countered by walking through the documented evidence piece by piece, showing the clear pattern of changed treatment immediately following my complaint. After the initial session, we split into separate rooms, and the real negotiation began. Margaret told me privately that our goal was to get the promotion, back pay, and ideally some additional compensation for the stress and damage to my career. She said companies rarely wanted these cases to go to court because discovery could expose other problematic practices and generate negative publicity. Robert shuttled between rooms for 3 hours, carrying offers and counteroffers. Catalyst initially offered me $25,000 to settle all claims and resign from the company, which was insulting and showed they still didn't grasp the seriousness of the situation. Margaret rejected it immediately and countered with a demand for the regional director position, $80,000 in back pay and damages, and a commitment to management training on discrimination. Daniel came back with an offer of $45,000 and an agreement not to contest unemployment if I chose to leave the company. We were nowhere close to agreement. Margaret said this was normal, that initial offers were usually lowball attempts to test resolve. She told me to prepare for a long negotiation and possibly no settlement at all. The breakthrough came when Robert brought a message from Patricia Whitmore saying she'd reviewed the DFEH findings in detail and was concerned about the company's exposure if this went to trial. She asked if there was any scenario where I'd consider staying with Catalyst Solutions in a different role, reporting to someone other than Jeffrey. Margaret and I discussed this privately, and I admitted I wasn't sure I wanted to stay with a company that had treated me this way. But I also recognized that leaving without the promotion would feel like defeat, like they'd successfully forced me out. Margaret suggested we explore what they were offering. The next proposal from Catalyst included the regional director position, but reporting to a different vice president in the Eastern region, effectively forcing me to relocate to New York. It also included full back pay from when the promotion should have taken effect, calculated as $43,000, and a commitment to remove the negative performance review from my file. No additional damages were mentioned. Margaret said this was progress, but still inadequate, and that I needed to decide if I was willing to relocate. I thought about it during a break, standing in the hallway of the DFEH office drinking bad coffee from a vending machine. The New York position would be a promotion and would get me away from Jeffrey, but it felt like exile. They were pushing me out of California to make their problem disappear. On the other hand, I'd have the title and salary I'd earned and a fresh start in a different part of the company. Margaret found me in the hallway and said we didn't have to accept anything we weren't comfortable with, that we could reject the settlement and pursue litigation if I wanted to fight for the original position here. I told her I needed to know if there was any scenario where Jeffrey faced consequences for what he'd done. She said that wasn't typically part of settlement agreements, that companies protected their managers and might provide additional training, but rarely fired anyone over discrimination findings unless there was a clear pattern of repeat behavior. That answer decided it for me. I told Margaret I wanted Jeffrey held accountable, not just myself made whole. If that meant litigation, I was willing to do it. Margaret went back into the mediation with that message, and things changed. Patricia Whitmore came into our room directly, which apparently wasn't standard protocol, but showed she wanted to resolve this. She sat down across from me and spoke directly, saying the company valued my contributions and regretted how this situation had been handled. She said they were prepared to offer me the regional director position in California, reporting to a different executive, along with full back pay, removal of the negative performance review, and $60,000 in additional compensation for the harm caused. In exchange, I'd sign a confidentiality agreement about the settlement terms and release all claims against the company. She added that Jeffrey Langford would be undergoing mandatory retraining on employment law and would be closely monitored going forward. I asked what would happen if Jeffrey engaged in similar conduct again. Patricia said if there were any future findings of discrimination or retaliation, his employment would be terminated immediately. It wasn't the same as firing him now, but it was something. I asked for time to discuss it with Margaret privately. Back in our room, Margaret laid out the pros and cons. The settlement was substantial, probably better than what I'd get through litigation even if I won, and it would resolve everything immediately instead of spending years in court. The confidentiality clause was standard and wouldn't prevent me from discussing the situation generally, just the specific settlement terms. The monitoring of Jeffrey created accountability, even if it wasn't termination. On the other hand, Jeffrey would keep his job, and his reputation would remain mostly intact, at least publicly. I'd be signing away my right to sue and accepting that justice would be partial rather than complete. Margaret said she'd support whatever I decided, but that in her experience, settlements like this were reasonable outcomes for employment discrimination cases. The system rarely delivered perfect justice, just compromises that allowed everyone to move forward. I accepted the settlement that afternoon, signing the agreement while Patricia Whitmore and Daniel Friedman signed for Catalyst Solutions. The total package was worth approximately $180,000 when you included the salary increase, back pay, and additional compensation. More importantly, I had the regional director title I'd earned and the validation that my complaint had merit. The DFEH case would be closed with a finding that discrimination and retaliation had occurred and been remedied through settlement. I walked out of that government building feeling exhausted, but vindicated. Margaret walked with me to the parking garage and congratulated me on standing up for myself. She said most people in my situation would have just left the company quietly instead of fighting, and that my willingness to pursue the complaint had likely prevented Jeffrey from doing the same thing to others in the future. I thanked her for her guidance and drove home, thinking about what came next. The transition at Catalyst Solutions happened quickly. Within a week, I was introduced to my new supervisor, a senior vice president named Thomas Whitfield, who oversaw sales operations for the entire western United States. Thomas's approach was night and day different from Jeffrey's. He reviewed my performance history, expressed genuine appreciation for the Apex deal, and asked what resources I needed to be successful in the regional director role. My new office was on a different floor from Jeffrey, which meant we rarely crossed paths. The sales team I'd be managing consisted of 12 people spread across California, Nevada, and Arizona, several of whom I already knew from company meetings. Kevin Ortiz was moved to a different role under Jeffrey's supervision, which I understood was part of the settlement reshuffling. I ran into Kevin in the break room a few weeks after everything was finalized, and we had an awkward but necessary conversation. He apologized for accepting the promotion under those circumstances and said he'd felt terrible when he learned the full story. I told him I didn't blame him for Jeffrey's decisions. Jeffrey and I had one final interaction about 6 months after the settlement. I was presenting quarterly results to the executive team, and he was in the room as part of his VP role. My numbers were exceptional, with the Western region exceeding targets by 34% and several major new deals in the pipeline. After the presentation, Jeffrey approached me in the hallway and said quietly that I'd done well. I looked at him, this man who'd tried to deny me what I'd earned and then retaliated when I fought back, and I said thank you with no emotion in my voice. He seemed like he wanted to say more, maybe offer some kind of explanation or justification, but I walked away before he could. I didn't need his approval or his excuses. I had the position I'd earned, and that was enough. A year after the settlement, I received a LinkedIn message from Dr. Priya Sharma at Apex Technologies. She said they were expanding their software infrastructure and wanted to discuss additional modules and services. She specifically requested to work with me again, saying my expertise and dedication had been instrumental in their decision to expand the original contract. That conversation led to a $12.5 million expansion deal, the largest in Catalyst Solutions history. When I closed that deal, Thomas Whitfield praised my work publicly at the company all-hands meeting and specifically mentioned how my relationship-building approach set the standard for the entire sales organization. I stood there accepting the recognition and glanced across the room where Jeffrey sat in the back. He was clapping along with everyone else, his face carefully neutral. I wondered if he thought about that Thursday afternoon when he'd handed my promotion to someone else, if he realized how much that decision had cost him in the long run. The person Jeffrey had underestimated wasn't just good at sales. I was someone who understood my worth and was willing to fight for it even when the system seemed designed to make me give up. He'd assumed I'd accept his decision quietly because that's what he was used to. employees who complained privately but never took formal action. He'd miscalculated badly, and while he kept his job, his authority was diminished and his decision-making was under scrutiny that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The regional director position he'd tried to deny me became the foundation for larger opportunities. Within 2 years, I was promoted to Senior Vice President of Sales, managing multiple regions and sitting in executive meetings where Jeffrey reported to people who reported to me. The organizational chart had fundamentally shifted, and the person he'd dismissed was now several levels above him in authority and influence. I've thought a lot about that afternoon in Jeffrey's office, the moment when he said I didn't need the promotion as much as Kevin did. What I've realized is that his statement revealed everything about how he viewed leadership and success. He thought need trumped merit, that personal circumstances should outweigh professional achievement. That perspective explains so many of his management failures that I'd witnessed over the years. He promoted people based on who he felt sorry for, rather than who deserved advancement. He made decisions based on superficial assessments, rather than objective data. The DFEH investigation and settlement didn't change Jeffrey's fundamental approach, but it did limit his ability to damage other careers the way he'd tried to damage mine. And maybe that was the real victory, not the money or the title, but the accountability that prevented him from repeating his mistakes without consequence. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.